The heavy silk of her wedding dress felt like a beautiful, suffocating prison. Clara had the burner phone, a fake passport, and exactly 4 minutes to escape Chicago's most ruthless crime boss. She thought her plan was flawless, but she didn't know he was already waiting in the getaway car. Clara Jenkins was not the kind of woman men went to war over. At 26, she had spent most of her life blending into the background, fully aware of how the world viewed her. She was a fat woman in a society that worshipped sharp angles and hollow cheeks. She was soft, plush, and carried her weight with a quiet dignity, preferring the safety of her ledgers and balance sheets over the superficial glitz of the Chicago elite. She worked as the head bookkeeper for her father's logistics company, Jenkins Freight, located in a dusty warehouse off South Holsted Street. It was a quiet, unassuming life. Until her father, Richard Jenkins, made the fatal mistake of borrowing $3 million from the Moretti syndicate to keep his failing business afloat. When Richard couldn't pay, the syndicate didn't send broken-nosed enforcers to collect. They sent the boss himself, Lorenzo Moretti. Lorenzo was a ghost in the Chicago underworld, a man whose name was whispered in the back rooms of City Hall and the high-stakes tables of underground casinos. He was ruthless, calculating, and possessed a chilling, aristocratic calmness. When he stepped into the cramped offices of Jenkins Freight, wearing a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Clara had been sitting at her desk, her thick thighs pressing against the cheap wood, her heart hammering against her ribs. She expected Lorenzo to demand the deed to the company. She expected violence. She did not expect his dark, predatory eyes to lock onto her and stay there. "Your father owes me a debt that his blood cannot repay," Lorenzo had said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. He hadn't looked at Richard. He only looked at Clara, his gaze tracing the soft curve of her jaw, the fullness of her breasts, the wide flare of her hips beneath her modest cardigan. "But I am a businessman, Mr. Jenkins. I am looking to transition my assets into legitimate corporate holdings. For that, I need a wife. Someone smart. Someone who understands numbers. Someone who won't ask foolish questions." Richard had stammered, pale and trembling. "Take the company, Moretti. Please." "I don't want the company," Lorenzo replied, finally stepping closer to Clara's desk. He leaned over, planting 2 large, scarred hands on her ledgers. He smelled of bergamot, expensive leather, and cold danger. "I want her. Clara marries me, and the debt is forgiven. You refuse, and I will burn this warehouse to the ground with you inside it." For Clara, there was no choice. She loved her father, despite his staggering incompetence. But more than that, she saw the terrifying finality in Lorenzo's eyes. She was an anomaly in his world. The Mafia boss was usually surrounded by manufactured, waif-thin models and socialites. Yet Lorenzo looked at her with a ravenous intensity that made her skin prickle. He didn't see her weight as a flaw. He looked at her as if she were a feast he had been starved of. The engagement was announced 3 days later in the Chicago Tribune. It was a complete shock to the city's high society. To the public, it was a sudden whirlwind romance between a wealthy investor and a logistics heiress. To Clara, it was a death sentence. Lorenzo spared no expense. He bought her a sprawling penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan and showered her in diamonds that felt like heavy chains. He was relentlessly attentive, yet utterly commanding. But Clara was not a submissive trophy. Her sharp mind, the very thing Lorenzo claimed to admire, went to work. She knew she couldn't marry him. If she signed those papers, she would be complicit in his empire of extortion and violence. So beneath the guise of a docile, overwhelmed bride-to-be, Clara began to plot. She quietly skimmed small amounts of cash from the wedding budget, just enough to hire Arthur Pendleton, a notorious underworld fixer who specialized in disappearing acts. Arthur arranged everything: a shadow vehicle, a flight out of O'Hare International Airport under the name Sarah Higgins, and a quiet life waiting in a small town in Nova Scotia. All Clara had to do was make it out of the hotel before she walked down the aisle. The day of the wedding arrived with a bitter, biting chill rolling off Lake Michigan. The venue was the iconic Drake Hotel on the Magnificent Mile, completely bought out and locked down by Lorenzo's men. Inside the opulent bridal suite, Clara stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror. Her custom-made gown was a masterpiece of heavy ivory silk, vintage lace, and intricate pearl beadwork. The designer had masterfully tailored the fabric to hug her generous curves, cinching her waist and flowing out into a dramatic train. She looked breathtaking, a vision of classic, voluptuous beauty. But beneath the layers of silk, her heart was beating like a trapped bird. "You look beautiful, Clara," her younger sister Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. Chloe was the only one who knew about the escape. "Is the hallway clear?" Clara asked, her voice tight. Chloe peeked out the heavy oak door. "The 2 guards are down at the end of the hall. The catering staff is bringing up the champagne carts now. It's exactly like Arthur said." Clara took a deep breath, the boning of her corset pressing into her ribs. She reached under the skirts of her dress, her thick thighs brushing together as she strapped the burner phone and the fake passport to her leg with a specialized garter. She slipped off her restrictive high heels, opting for a pair of soft, white ballet flats she had hidden in her makeup bag. "I love you, Chloe. Tell Dad I'm sorry," Clara whispered, pulling her sister into a fierce, desperate hug. "Just run, Clara. Don't look back." At 1:15 p.m., perfectly timed with the caterer's arrival, a planned distraction occurred. A smoke alarm tripped in the hotel's main kitchen, sending a wave of panicked staff rushing through the corridors. In the chaos, Clara slipped out of the bridal suite. She moved with surprising agility, her heart pounding in her ears. The heavy silk of her dress swished around her ankles, a dangerous liability, so she gathered the fabric in her fists, hiking it up to her knees. She darted into the service stairwell, the heavy fire door clicking shut behind her. Down. She had to go down 6 flights. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The physical exertion of rushing down the concrete stairs in a 50-pound gown was immense. Sweat beaded on her forehead, ruining her immaculate makeup. Her calves burned, but the adrenaline masked the pain. She was doing it. She was actually escaping the devil of Chicago. She burst through the ground floor exit, spilling out into the dimly lit private loading dock at the rear of the hotel. The biting November wind hit her bare shoulders, making her shiver. There it was, just as Arthur promised. A sleek, black Lincoln town car idling near the dumpsters, its engine a low, comforting hum. The tinted windows hid the driver, but the hazard lights flashed twice. The signal. Clara practically threw herself towards the vehicle. She grabbed the heavy metal handle of the rear passenger door and yanked it open. She climbed inside, dragging the massive skirts of her wedding dress in behind her, gasping for air as she collapsed onto the plush leather seats. "Go," she panted, not looking up, busy trying to untangle the layers of tulle from her legs. "Arthur, please, just drive. He's going to realize I'm gone any second." The car didn't move. The silence in the vehicle was sudden and absolute, heavy with a thick, suffocating dread. Slowly, Clara raised her head. The man sitting in the driver's seat didn't turn around. Instead, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the loading dock, dressed in a flawless, midnight blue tuxedo. Lorenzo. Clara's blood ran ice-cold. She lunged for the door handle, but before her fingers could even graze the plastic, a sharp electronic thwack echoed through the cabin. The doors locked. Lorenzo walked to the side of the car, his movements slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly calm. He opened the rear door on the opposite side and slid into the back seat next to her. The door shut behind him with a heavy thud, sealing them inside the soundproof cabin. Clara pressed her back against the window, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with sheer terror. Lorenzo didn't look angry. That was the most terrifying part. He looked entirely composed, almost amused, as he slowly reached out and adjusted a piece of lace that had fallen over Clara's trembling shoulder. "Did you really think," Lorenzo said, his voice a velvet purr that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, "that you could hire Arthur Pendleton in my city without my permission?" Clara couldn't speak. Her throat was completely dry. "Arthur works for me, Clara. He always has," Lorenzo continued, his dark eyes trailing down the flushed, panicked skin of her chest, resting on the frantic rise and fall of her heavy breathing. "I let you plan this. I let you buy the passport. I let you think you had a choice. Because I wanted to see how far you would go. He leaned in, the scent of bergamot and impending doom wrapping around her. He reached down, his large hand brushing against her thick thigh, right where the fake passport was strapped. He pulled the document free and casually tossed it onto the floorboards. "I told you I wanted a smart wife," Lorenzo whispered, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. He grabbed her chin, his grip firm, forcing her to look into his bottomless, predatory eyes. "But the game ends here, Mia Cara." He signaled the driver. The black Lincoln pulled away from the loading dock, slipping seamlessly into the chaotic Chicago traffic, moving farther and farther away from the airport. "Where are we going?" Clara choked out, tears of absolute defeat finally spilling over her lashes. Lorenzo's thumb gently, almost lovingly, wiped a tear from her cheek. "We are going to the church," Lorenzo said softly, a dark, possessive smile curving his lips. "You are going to walk down that aisle, and you are my wife now." The wedding ceremony was a blurred nightmare of flashing cameras, heavy incense, and the suffocating grip of Lorenzo's hand on hers. Clara stood at the altar of Holy Name Cathedral, her responses automated, her spirit entirely fractured. When Lorenzo slid the cold, heavy platinum band onto her finger, it felt like the closing of a vault. The reception in the Gold Coast room of the Drake Hotel was a lavish display of power. Politicians, judges, and underworld lieutenants immingled under crystal chandeliers, all pretending this was a romance and not a transaction. Clara sat at the head table, the heavy silk of her dress weighing her down like a physical manifestation of her despair. She refused to eat, refused to parle, staring blankly at the towering 6-tier cake. "You are drawing unnecessary attention, mia sposa," Lorenzo murmured, his breath warm against her temple. He reached under the heavy damask tablecloth, his large hand resting assertively on her thick thigh. The heat of his palm seared through her silk stockings. "Smile for the cameras, Clara. Let them see a woman deeply in love." "I am a prisoner," Clara replied, her voice barely a whisper, not daring to look at him. "Do not ask me to act like a willing one." Lorenzo's jaw tightened. "Tonight, You are my wife. Tomorrow, you will see exactly why I chose you." The next morning, Clara awoke in the master suite of Lorenzo's sprawling penthouse atop the Palmolive building. The bed was massive, tangled in silk sheets, but Lorenzo was already gone, leaving only the scent of bergamot behind. Clara pulled a thick velvet robe over her soft, plush curves, her body aching from the tension of the previous day. She found him in his private study, a room lined with dark mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the churning, grey waters of Lake Michigan. He was sitting behind a massive desk, nursing an espresso. He didn't look like a mob boss. He looked like a Fortune 500 CEO. "Sit," Lorenzo commanded, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him. Clara obeyed, wrapping the robe tighter around her full figure, suddenly hyper-aware of how deeply his gaze raked over her body. There was no mockery in his eyes, only a fierce, dark hunger that made her pulse race despite her hatred for him. He slid a thick manila folder across the desk. Stamped across the top in bold red ink was the logo of PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the most ruthless forensic accounting firms in the world. "What is this?" Clara asked, her brow furrowing. "That," Lorenzo said, leaning back and steepling his fingers, "is the true financial history of Jenkins Freight over the last 5 years. I suggest you read it, Clara. Your mind is sharp. You will see what your father could not hide from me." Clara opened the file. Her eyes, trained in ledgers and balance sheets, scanned the first page, then the second. Her breath hitched. The numbers didn't make sense. The $3 million her father had borrowed from the Moretti syndicate wasn't lost to bad investments or failing contracts. It was deliberately diverted. She traced the routing numbers: shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, a private offshore account with Credit Suisse. He didn't lose the money," Clara whispered, her voice trembling as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal washed over her. "He embezzled it. He stole your money and hid it. $5 million in total, once you account for the skimmed profits from his own employees' pension fund," Lorenzo corrected softly. "Richard Jenkins is not a desperate, failing businessman, Clara. He is a thief. He knew I would eventually come to collect. He offered you to me not to save his company, but to buy himself time. He believed I would use you, grow bored, and dispose of you while he quietly relocated to Belize." Clara dropped the file. The walls of the study felt like they were closing in. Her father, the man she had sacrificed her entire life for, the man she had willingly walked into the devil's arms to save, had sold her for a retirement fund. He had known Lorenzo's reputation. He had expected her to be abused, or worse, killed. A hot, blinding rage erupted in Clara's chest. It was a vicious, unfamiliar emotion, burning away the timid, compliant bookkeeper she had always been. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of absolute fury. Lorenzo stood, walking slowly around the desk. He knelt beside her chair, a stark contrast to his imposing height. He reached out, his scarred hands gently cupping her face. For a man so immersed in violence, his touch was agonizingly tender. "The world has always underestimated you, because you do not fit their narrow, fragile definition of value," Lorenzo said, his voice a low rumble. "Your father saw you as a shield. I see you as a queen. I did not buy you, Clara. I freed you." He wiped the angry tears from her jaw. "You are brilliant. You see the invisible lines that connect money, power, and leverage. My empire is vast, but it is chaotic. I am transitioning into legitimate holdings, real estate, commercial shipping, municipal contracts. I need a partner who understands the anatomy of a corporate takeover. I need you. Clara looked into his dark eyes, the terrifying reality of her situation shifting. She wasn't just a captive wife in a gilded cage. Lorenzo was handing her the keys to the kingdom. "What happens to my father?" Clara asked, her voice turning cold, a hardened edge clipping her words. Lorenzo smiled, a dark, predatory curve of his lips. "Whatever you want to happen to him, Mia Regina. The ledger is yours now." Over the next 6 months, the Chicago underworld felt the seismic shift. Clara Moretti stopped running. She took the sprawling, unorganized, legitimate assets of the Moretti syndicate and ruthlessly streamlined them. Operating out of a sleek corner office in the Aeon Center, Clara became a phantom terror in the corporate world. She wore custom Oscar de la Renta suits that hugged her generous curves and celebrated her plush figure, a physical manifestation of her newly claimed power. She was no longer the soft, invisible bookkeeper. She was the architect of Lorenzo's new empire. She absorbed rival logistics firms, restructured shell companies, and laundered millions through impenetrable, perfectly legal corporate structures. And Lorenzo worshipped her. Behind closed doors, his obsession with her mind and her body only deepened. He treated her heavy, voluptuous frame like a religious artifact, his devotion absolute and unwavering. But power in Chicago never goes unchallenged, and Clara was about to face the true cost of wearing the Mafia's crown. The Winter Gala at the Art Institute of Chicago was the social event of the year. The modern wing, with its sweeping glass ceilings and stark white architecture, was packed with the city's elite. Mayors, senators, and billionaires sipped champagne beneath priceless works of art. It was Clara's masterpiece. She had orchestrated the entire event under the guise of the Moretti Foundation, cementing their family's transition from underworld thugs to untouchable philanthropists. Clara stood near a massive Picasso, holding a crystal flute of sparkling water. She wore a plunging, deep emerald velvet gown that gripped her thick waist and flared beautifully over her wide hips. Diamonds dripped from her collarbones. She caught Lorenzo's eye across the room. He was speaking with an alderman, looking lethal in a midnight black tuxedo. The heat in his stare, even from 50 feet away, made Clara's breath catch. But the idyllic triumph was a fragile illusion. Clara's mind, always processing data, began to notice anomalies. She had personally vetted the private security detail, Aegis Defense, hiring them for the night. The contract stipulated that all guards wear a specific silver lapel pin shaped like a shield. As Clara watched a guard secure the exits near the catering kitchens, she frowned. The guard's lapel was bare. She turned her gaze to the mezzanine. 2 more guards, standing unnaturally rigid, their hands hovering too close to their suit jackets. No silver pins. Her blood ran cold. A hostile takeover. There was only one man bold enough to strike Lorenzo in a public venue filled with politicians. Sal Greco, the aging boss of the West Side crew, who was rapidly losing territory to Clara's aggressive corporate expansions. Clara didn't panic. She didn't scream. The timid girl who had tried to run away from her wedding was dead. The woman who remained was a cold, calculating tactician. She smoothly placed her glass on a passing waiter's tray and unclasped her diamond clutch. Inside was an encrypted earpiece, directly linked to Lorenzo's personal enforcers. She slipped it into her ear, hiding it beneath her dark hair. "Marco," Clara whispered, turning her back to the room and pretending to admire the painting. "We have a breach. At least 4 imposters in Aegis uniforms. South exits and the mezzanine." "Understood, Mrs. Moretti." Marco's gruff voice crackled in her ear. "Extracting the boss now. Stay put." Clara turned around just in time to see Sal Greco himself stepping out of the VIP elevator. He wasn't there to assassinate Lorenzo quietly. He was there to make a public statement. But what made Clara's heart stop was the man walking nervously 3 paces behind Greco. Richard Jenkins, her father. Greco had found the one man who hated Lorenzo enough to supply the architectural blueprints of the Art Institute's security grid, blueprints Richard still had access to through residual ties in the municipal planning office. Chaos erupted silently before the public even noticed. Marco and 2 enforcers moved to flank Lorenzo, but Greco's men drew suppressed weapons. The muffled thwip-thwip of gunfire was masked by the swelling classical music from the string quartet. Glass shattered above them. Panic swept the room as the politicians finally realized what was happening, diving for cover in a wave of tailored suits and evening gowns. Lorenzo was trapped. He had been pushed into a dead-end corridor leading to the museum's administrative offices, pinned down by heavy fire from Greco's men. Clara knew Marco couldn't reach him in time. She had to act. Lifting the heavy velvet skirts of her gown, Clara moved rapidly through the terrified crowd, using her knowledge of the event's logistics. She bypassed the main floor and slipped into the catering service elevator. "Clara, what are you doing? Get out of the building!" Lorenzo's voice barked through the earpiece, ragged and breathless. "I'm fixing this," Clara replied, her voice remarkably steady. She reached the security control room on the 2nd floor. The 2 Aegis guards inside were unconscious on the floor, neutralized by Greco's men. Clara stepped over them, her breath heavy, and approached the main terminal. She had designed the security override protocols herself when she negotiated the venue contract. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She bypassed the firewall with the backdoor codes she had memorized. On the monitors, she saw Greco's men advancing down the corridor toward Lorenzo's position. "Hold on, Lorenzo," she murmured. Clara slammed the enter key. Instantly, the museum's automated fire suppression system engaged, but only in that specific corridor. Heavy steel fire doors dropped from the ceiling on both ends of the hallway with a deafening crash, trapping Greco and his men inside, isolating them completely from Lorenzo. Seconds later, the halon gas system activated, sucking the oxygen out of the sealed corridor. Through the monitor, Clara watched Greco and his hitmen collapse against the glass, gasping for air, their weapons useless. It was over. 10 minutes later, the Chicago PD had surrounded the building, heavily bribed by the Moretti payroll to handle the unfortunate gas leak quietly. Lorenzo burst into the security room, his tuxedo torn, blood grazing his cheek. He looked frantic, terrified, an emotion Clara had never seen on the ruthless Mafia boss. When he saw her standing by the monitors, completely unharmed, he crossed the room in 2 massive strides and pulled her into a crushing embrace. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. "You foolish, brilliant woman," he breathed against her skin, his hands gripping her thick waist as if she were the only anchor keeping him tethered to the earth. "You could have been killed." "I told you," Clara said softly, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders. "I understand the anatomy of a takeover. Nobody takes what belongs to me." Lorenzo pulled back, looking at her with a reverence that bordered on religious. His hands cupped her face, smearing a faint trace of his blood on her cheek. "You are my empire, Clara. Everything I have, everything I am. it is yours." Before they left the museum, Lorenzo led Clara to the loading docks. Surrounded by 6 heavily armed guards, a single man was kneeling on the cold concrete. Richard Jenkins. He looked up at Clara, his face pale, trembling in the bitter Chicago wind. It was the exact same loading dock where Clara had tried to run away 6 months ago. The poetry of the moment was not lost on her. "Clara, please," Richard begged, tears streaming down his face. "He forced me. Greco forced me. I'm your father." Clara stood beside Lorenzo, her velvet dress pooling on the concrete, radiating a terrifying, icy calm. She looked down at the man who had stolen her future, sold her to a monster, and then tried to have them both killed to cover his tracks. "You were my father," Clara said, her voice echoing in the empty space. "But I am a Moretti now." She turned to Lorenzo. "Drain his offshore accounts, every penny. Seize Jenkins' freight. Dissolve the assets, and leave him with nothing. Ban him from Chicago. If he crosses the city limits again, kill him." Richard screamed as the guards dragged him away into the darkness, but Clara didn't flinch. She didn't look back. Lorenzo led her to the waiting black Lincoln town car, the same car she had tried to escape in. He opened the door for her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of dark pride and overwhelming lust. Clara slid into the back seat, her plush curves settling into the leather. Lorenzo climbed in beside her. With a sharp electronic thwack, the doors locked. 6 months ago, the sound had been the closing of a coffin. Tonight, Clara smiled. She reached over, her soft hand gripping the lapel of Lorenzo's ruined tuxedo, and pulled his lips down to hers. She didn't need to run anymore. She had taken the devil's throne, and the locked door was no longer keeping her in. It was keeping everyone else out. Did Clara make the right choice by embracing the darkness, or should she have kept running? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this intense Mafia romance, hit that like button, share this story with your friends who love a good plot twist, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping, real-life inspired dramas. Don't forget to ring the notification bell.